Hello everyone, it's Ben here again to introduce another edition of Rosaries Rewind. As I mentioned last time, we're taking a bit of a break from recording, but I've dug into our archives for some older episodes that we think are still relevant. This time, with Remembrance Sunday happening this weekend, we've gone all the way back to 2020 when the podcast was still in its infancy. Adam and I took some baby steps by talking about Remembrance and our issues with how it's celebrated. I've cut out our Mind Grape segment as it's all out-of-date chat about politics, because as we know, 2020 was roughly a million years ago. Enjoy the blast from the past. So, today's main topic, we are going to talk about Remembrance. It is November the 6th today, which makes Sunday Remembrance Sunday. And next week we will have the 11th, which is Remembrance Day.
My favourite holiday of the... Oh, no, it's not a holiday, is it? Sorry, I got confused there because so many people treat it like it is.
No, it's
Sorry,
fine.
This is my rant now. This is my fucking rant.
Sorry. Let me start, of course. I've been very rude by wishing you a very happy war Christmas.
Oh my. Thanks.
You're welcome. So, Adam, you wear a white poppy. Why, you filthy, peace-loving hippie, do you do that rather than wearing the proper British red poppy?
A British red poppy. If it was really British, it'd be red, white, and blue.
That's right. The theme of today's episode is that the Royal British Legion is not nationalist enough.
Yeah, I want a little Union flag right in the middle. Why do I wear a white poppy? For me, and obviously, like the white poppy, like the Peace Pledge Union who make the white poppy wouldn't necessarily say this themselves. But like for me, I started wearing the white poppy because I could no longer wear the red one. I came to realise that it didn't represent, firstly, what it claimed to represent, and it didn't represent a lot of the things that it should have represented as well. So the white poppy was first produced in 1933 by the Cooperative Women's Guild, who were a group of women who had, I think mostly, in fact, possibly, were war widows from World War I. And they asked for red poppies to have the words "No More War" printed in the middle. And they were denied that. So they started producing their own white poppies in 1933 to challenge that narrative that was quite obvious to them from the outset. And this is where a lot of people who don't wear the red poppy will say, well, it's become something that I disagree with. It's become nationalistic. It's become militaristic. For me, when I look back at the history of that, yeah, there's been a surge in that in recent years, but actually it's always been that. That's always been a part of it. It used to have the words Haig Fund printed in the middle after Field Marshal Haig, who, arguably was responsible for a lot of deaths in World War I. That has been a part of its history from the outset. The white poppy was created to represent all victims of war, civilian, military, British, German, whatever. So yeah, in a nutshell, there's a little history of why I have a problem with the red poppy and why I wear the white poppy instead. There is, of course, a lot more we can go into with this, and I'm sure we will. We'll look more at the Royal British Legion as we go along.
Yeah. So I don't wear a red or a white poppy, and that's because obviously that white poppy comes from a kind of pacifist tradition. I am not a pacifist. That is not my approach. But as I understand it, the red poppy represents British forces, right? The people who have died fighting for Britain. So what it doesn't represent, for me, are the people who went and fought in the Spanish Civil War against fascism. Yep. The British battalion, many of them went over to fight against fascism in Spain, and they are not, the people that died doing that are not represented by that poppy. The people who went over and fought for the YPG in Syria fought against ISIS.
Yeah.
And, were actually one of the few people having real success against ISIS. They're not represented Hell, some of them get arrested when they come back.
Well,
to
yeah,
the
yeah,
country.
exactly.
But, the people that are actually, still now going out and fighting against people like ISIS are not represented by that poppy. And so the question then becomes, well, why on earth not? Why are the brave men and women who died in Spain fighting against the rise of fascism all over again in Europe not represented by the poppy? What is that meant to achieve? And I think that's really important to me, that at a certain point it goes from respecting people who have given their lives in the purpose of something greater than themselves to some sort of propaganda for the British forces. And I think that's a very, very different thing. Even if you accept, okay, we need one that just represents British people, which I don't, but let's take that as read. The fact it doesn't even represent the British people who died fighting against ISIS and fascism, both of which I think most of us think are good causes, that means that I can't bring myself to wear a red poppy, even while I won't wear a white poppy, because I am not necessarily a fascist. No, I'm definitely not a fascist. I'm not a pacifist.
Thank God you're not a fascist. I've been.
Let me just make that public service announcement. I am neither a pacifist. A pacifist? Oh, this is just
going well.
I've been awake a very long time. I took out the dog for a walk at 6 a.m. this morning, and I have been on the go since, and words are difficult.
All right, first academic alert. Wiggum, Ralph.
I won!
No, Ralph. This means you're failing English.
Me fail English? That's impossible.
So we've got the poppy, and the poppy is the trademark and the property and the fundraising campaign of the Royal British Legion. Adam, tell us a bit more about the Royal British Legion.
Yeah, so the key things I think we should be talking about here with the Royal British Legion. I mean, I think it's important first to acknowledge some of the work that they do. They do support, ex-troops and current serving troops as well. They do help people recover from some horrific injuries. Why do they do that? Because the state refuses to, right? That's why they're there fundamentally. And the Royal British Legion will never challenge that, because they are, in effect, an arm of the state, right? Just that they're funded by donations and poppies, and sometimes by the taxpayer as well. There's a few loopholes that they jump through as well, but yeah, mostly through donations and poppies. They accept donations from multiple arms companies, BAE, Lockheed Martin, Thales, amongst others, who sponsor their events and stick their branding on, next to the poppy as well.
And I think it's really important, to talk about, let's just talk about the economic interests of those companies and be really clear that these companies profit from more wars, they profit from more dead people. And that is what they need to happen in the world to carry on making big profits. And so for the Royal British Legion to take money from those people, either the Royal British Legion are taking money from people who are really stupid and are working against their own aims, or, and I think this is the truth, the Royal British Legion serve the purposes of arms companies who need there to be war, who need there to be dead people for them to make a profit. And that is really quite worrying.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the Royal British Legion is not fundamentally there to make life easier for servicemen and women, or former servicemen and women. It is there to promote a narrative and to engage in acts that are materially detrimental to those people they are supposed to be serving.
That's really important as well, I think, because people will say, oh, you guys hate the military, you hate armed forces. And to that, I want to say, we might hate them as institutions, although hate is probably too strong a word, but we dislike them as institutions. But the people within those institutions are people we are trying to help. By dismantling this stuff, we are trying to stop these people from dying far, far too young in far-flung foreign lands.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got you've got this materialistic element to it. And that gets worse because, here's a quite incredible thing. In 2012, the president of the Royal British Legion, a guy by the name of Lieutenant General Sir John Kisley, was recorded admitting to lobbying on behalf of these arms companies, saying that Remembrance Day was a tremendous, this is a quote, tremendous networking opportunity, and boasting of his access to the Prime Minister, Defence Secretary and Chief of Defence Staff, saying, quote, "You are standing there waiting for the Queen with nothing else to talk about."
The undercover team was also apparently offered special access by Lieutenant General Sir John Kisley, once head of the Defence Academy.
Sounds terribly grand. You're standing there waiting for the Queen with nothing else to talk about, Philip Hammond, then whatever.
Then we're working for this company.
And, you know, that is extremely useful for context.
This has material consequences. This is about money again. It's always about money.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to recognise that what you've got here is the Royal British Legion, in the way that they're doing remembrance things and poppies, are essentially acting as lobbyists on behalf of arms firms. And that is gross. That is really disgusting, because what's happening there is this is the Royal British Legion claiming to look after service people and ex-service people, while actually using their difficulties and their suffering as a way of promoting the interests of the company who profit off those people's suffering. That is horrible. That is a really awful situation, and it's really clear that that is exactly what they do. The Royal British Legion is terrible for service people.
Yeah. And actually, not only are they lobbyists on behalf of these awful companies, there's a sort of another thing going on where they're almost, their whole propagandistic model is almost lobbying, you know, the general public as well.
If you go onto the website for the Royal British Legion, specifically says that wearing a poppy is a sign of support for the British Armed Forces. Which I think is obviously actually quite a loaded thing.
Oh, yeah.
Or it should be, at least. So, Adam, tell me a little bit more about how that all kind of entwines with nationalism and militarism.
Yeah, well, I think one of the interesting things that you've seen in the wake of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars is a decline in support for wars in general in the British public. And so there's been a change in approach, where you've now got politicians and governments and organisations that are parallel to that, like the Royal British Legion, now focusing more on support for the armed forces, but also support for the state through patriotism and nationalism. And those things, I mean, there's many, many studies that have proven the links between those things. They go hand in hand. Nationalism and militarism go hand in hand. So, yeah, so what you've seen is a massive increase in a wider cultural narrative of supporting our boys, basically. So there was a report from the Tory MP, Marc Francois. I assume I'm saying that right.
Yes, I believe, ironically, he does have quite a foreign-sounding name, which, yes, pretty ironic considering his opinion.
Yes, yeah. So he authored a report in 2009, which has the name Filling the Ranks.
What I like about people like Marc Francois and his kind of hard Brexiteer Tory colleagues is that they are not ones for hiding their light under a bushel. They will just say the subtext. And Filling the Ranks is an absolutely vintage example of that. Usually, we don't as explicitly be like, we're doing this because we need to recruit for the military. But that sort of double talk is not for Marc Francois. He is just going to call it Filling the Ranks.
Yeah. So it's just very on the nose, right? But a lot of people aren't going to see even that, right? Because there has been such a sustained narrative for such a long time on this. And, you know, we've always been a militaristic society. But yeah, in recent years, I think that has increased. And the approach to that is always changing. You can see in this report, Marc Francois basically says that there needs to be a massive increase in attempts to recruit from certain places. And he suggests things like the increase in cadet forces in schools, which has happened. There has been a massive increase. And when I say massive, I mean many times over, massive increase in cadet forces in schools. And he also wants increased visits from military personnel in schools. And all of this has happened, right? This is a 2009 report. So all of this has happened and is happening. So people say there is not a narrative happening, and not a militaristic narrative happening. The statistics don't bear that out, right? The statistics are quite clear that there has been a massive increase in this.
Yeah, and I think, you and I know that people who are listening to this probably going to find me this, but if you put this in the ears of the average churchgoer in the UK, even though what we're talking about is a fairly mild criticism, really, based in a desire for peace, and we are not exactly going for it, people would be upset to hear us criticizing both the poppy and the armed forces. And I think that tells you a lot about how effective this kind of militarism narrative has been embedded into our society. And you can see it in lots of ways. There's the old joke about everyone over 60 in this country seems to believe they fought in World War II and bases their politics on some sort of a vicarious victory that they took no part in World War II. But also, things like Boris Johnson is doing everything he possibly can to make himself seem Churchillian, right? He wants to be seen as Winston Churchill, despite the fact that we have to remember that the people of this country, by 1945, despised Churchill and booted him out of government unceremoniously for a radical, if still, as we talked about earlier, sometimes quite racist, Labour Party that wanted to really change things and went against almost everything Churchill stood for. And, what you've got now is this kind of forgetting of history, of the reality of how unpopular even the Second World War was for a lot of the time it was fought. And instead you've got people desperate to seem like the leaders that we had in that war, or to ape things like those keep calm and carry on posters that, although they were never used in the war, because people, when they went to focus groups, absolutely despised their patronizing tone, they're now super popular because they make us feel like what we're doing is really the same in some way as the Second World War. And I think one of the most dangerous things that's come out of that is what you get right now, which is where the British Navy is trying to get involved in, well, let's be blunt about it, drowning more migrants in the Channel. And the language around that is so militaristic. It's so based in war and armed forces, and even things like the Battle of Britain and defending these islands from incredibly distressed, vulnerable people crossing the Channel in very small numbers, really, compared to the population of the country at large, in dinghies. And our response is to send the Navy out to make sure they drown. And I think that speaks volumes about what sort of militaristic narrative exists in this society.
Yeah, it absolutely does. When you see this from the point of view of even other Europeans, right? Anyone from outside of the UK can see that we have an obsession with World War II and this idealized British spirit. The lionization of those who, let's be honest, people were sent off to die in 2 world wars who were, a lot of them, going to be absolutely terrified, but if they didn't go, they faced being shot against a wall, right? And yet they are held up as these warriors, who defended these islands. And I'm not saying they weren't, right? Like I want to show solidarity with those people, but they were forced.
Yeah, and I think there's a really important distinction between saying there are these people as they actually lived and existed, and what they kind of did, and for some of them that was quite a heroic thing. Particularly, I think we should make it as clear as possible. We weren't keen on the Nazis. The Nazis, we think, are bad. Yep. They were bad then, and they're bad now. And, going and fighting the Nazis is probably a good thing to do. But what you have to recognize is the difference between the actual people, the real living human beings who fought and died in pursuit of that cause, and the kind of reanimated corpse of them that is used to serve this ideological agenda, right? When we talk about World War II and the sacrifice people made, we're not really talking about the genuine people who died in Flanders fields, right? We are talking about an idea of what sort of people we should be, what sort of country we should be. And actually, it's pretty gross the way that we use these real people who lived and then died far, far, far too young as a way of propping up our culture. And I think it's quite important to note that one of the reasons we reach back for Second World War is that, as you've mentioned, the war that we've had recently have been pretty bad. You know, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, you know, those were pretty much horrible failures that made not only life worse in those countries, but also put us in more danger. And so people rightly are very suspicious of wars. But by reaching back to that Second World War, we can justify our kind of nationalism and that military-based culture based on this imagined past of what brilliant people we were in World War II. And I think that also links to the other really important thing, which is to say World War II is one of the few times where we were the good guys. You know, the history of Britain's action in the world is a history of oppression and domination and slavery. Mm-hmm. It is not a history of us being the good guy, with one small exception of the Second World War. And that is a really important reason we reach back to that to justify what we have now.
It's also really important to say that even the Second World War was based on the failings and the kind of political machinations of people, not just in the UK, but in other countries as well, who did not give a single shit about the huge numbers of normal working class people they were sending off to die, right? World War I was a disgrace, an absolute disgrace. And the reason the Nazis got power was because of World War I and the fallout from that, right? So the idea that we can then go back to World War II and say, oh, look at us. No. You've got to accept the fact that World War II was a consequence of actions that were collectively taken by governments in Europe. And I think that's why it's so gross to me that we use either of the world wars to further this nationalistic narrative. And I think that really comes into sharp focus when you think about how we conduct remembrance services, particularly in church.
Let's talk a little bit about the relationship between Remembrance and the church. I don't know if you've seen this, but earlier this week, some new guidance came in about Remembrance services. So obviously we are in the first Friday in lockdown because it's Friday night and we like to party. Obviously Adam and I would usually be out clubbing, taking large amounts of illegal drugs and doing other cool... I ran out of cool things. No, we would probably be at home recording the podcast anyway. Lockdown has not affected our social life at all. But obviously church services are not happening at the minute, and we can maybe talk about some of that and the reaction to it on a future episode. But I think there was guidance put out in the last couple of days basically saying how you can still do remembrance services this Sunday. They have to be outside, and you're allowed to sing 2 hymns, one of which has to be the national anthem, and you are allowed to have a bugle player. So that's important, but you're only allowed to have military bands. Normal bands, not allowed, but military bands are fine because COVID is scared of insignia. So that's helpful. So yeah, I think it's really interesting to note how church services are no longer permitted, but remembrance is apparently so important that it still has to go on regardless.
Yeah, and I think this is the thing, is that the church sold itself to militarism a long time ago. Of course, yeah. and nationalism a long time ago.
Well, I mean, we're both members of the Church of England, so, you know, we are members of a national church that has a long and unpleasant history of supporting the state.
That's right, yeah. I have long had issues with nationalism, and I've long had issues with nationalism, particularly in a church context, and we can get to why at some point if we want to. Point is, I do and I did and I had expressed that on many occasions. In the last 10 years or so, I have been to 2 remembrance services. I go to church every Sunday, more or less, but when Remembrance Sunday comes around, I find it so distasteful that I don't go. Before you even get to whether you should be singing the national anthem in church or not, the correct answer is obviously no.
Extremely hot take here for me. I think the national anthem is blasphemous.
Mate, 100%. 100%. Like what we're talking about here,
No real Christian to be singing the national anthem. Sorry, I'm done. There we
Well,
go.
I 100%
Okay.
agree. What we're talking about here is civic religion, right? That's what scholars call it. They call it civic religion because it does the same things to you physically that a religious experience does. Stephen Backhouse is an interesting guy on this kind of stuff, and I think he says, I love it. He says, yes, it makes your little heart go pitter patter, and it's absolutely right. That's exactly what it does. It does the same stuff. It stimulates the same receptors in the brain that a religious experience does. It is blasphemous. So I completely agree.
Yeah, and I just think there's something about the way that the church is co-opted by state power that is quite antithetical to what Christianity to me should be. Our job is not to prop up the state, and that is really what we're doing. Our job is not to pump out propaganda for the state. And let's be honest, most Remembrance Sunday services that do anything more than, okay, we'll have a 2-minute silence in the middle of our normal service, kind of just pump out propaganda for the state. And I think that's, if you are someone who takes your Christian faith seriously, that should make your skin crawl.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I mean, I think when you actually delve into this stuff a little bit and you start looking at what Jesus said and you start looking at what the early church said, it's quite incredible that we can do it the way we do it and still think that it's Christian. When Jesus is approached and he's asked whether we should pay taxes, we often interpret that as Jesus saying, yeah, pay your taxes. It's good. It builds roads or whatever, right? That is a terrible interpretation. It's not accurate. What Jesus did is he used irony in that moment to make a point about who God was and who Caesar was and how their kingdoms were so different, right? He said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. When he looked at that coin, everything in that coin, the whole of the Roman emperor's cult was contained in that coin. And Jesus said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. He said, this is trash. That's what he was saying. Throw it away. Our state is Caesar, right? What we are doing here is we are looking at this coin and we're saying, oh, I want that. Yeah, bring that into church.
Yeah, and I think, for me, if you can't work out why that's gross, have a look at when they do Patriot Day services in big American churches. Have a look at when they fly the flag and they talk about what an amazing country America is. And then remember what's just happened in the elections in America. And you know what? The only difference between what is happening in a lot of Remembrance Sunday services and what we see on Patriot Day in America is the fact that as a country, we're marginally more tasteful than the Americans. It's a difference exclusively of form and not of content. They are doing exactly the same things and serving the same causes. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and I'm afraid the poppy is very much Caesar's.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to just briefly, very quickly, because we're running out of time, touch on the question of, okay, what should we do with Remembrance then? Because actually, I don't think it's a terrible idea. I think it's really important for us to remember the dead, the actual dead, not the kind of ideological construct of the dead, which serves to remind us how much we should be thankful to our military, but the people who actually fought and died, both for the occasional just thing and more often than not because they had absolutely no choice. And I think it is really important, actually, to bring that as a church and to mourn the dead because they are really dead. Yeah. They are not just a rhetorical device. They are real people who did not live anywhere near as long as they should because of a disgusting, violent system in which we live. So I think Remembrance should be something the church is doing, but I think it should be doing it properly, remembering the actual people rather than just remembering the propaganda that the dead have been used to form.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to emphasize that point, actually, that we are not against remembrance. Remembrance is really, really important. And actually, for me personally, that's why I find it distasteful enough not to go to church for nearly 10 years. Remembrance is important, and I want to remember and mourn the people who were sent off to die for pointless reasons by those in power who now, whose descendants at least, now co-opt the names and the sacrifices of those people. So yeah, I absolutely do want to do that, but it's got to be a time of mourning. Get the flags out of it, right? Get the military emblems and symbolism out of it, and frankly, get the Royal British Legion out of it, because they have been there the whole way with the state, turning this into what is little more than a slightly sorrowful patriotic party.
That then will do us for this week's edition of Rosaries Rewind. I hope you're all having a good time. I hope that you're not too terrified of the insane Muslim communist that's taken over New York and are mourning the sad death of peace-loving politician Dick Cheney this week. It's a scary time to be in the world. If you want to get in touch with us, feedback, thoughts, ideas, demands that we get at a recording, you can do so through all the contact details on breadandrosaries.com. Otherwise, I've got another edition lined up with our sequel episode to this one that should be coming out at some point next week. So look forward to that. At least you've got something to keep going for. And we will see you all next time. Bye-bye.